January 17, 1944. Kwajalein Atoll, Marshall Islands. The tropical sun burned white against the coral sand. Palm fronds hung motionless in air thick with salt and the distant rumble of artillery. Lieutenant Commander Yoshio Kazuki stood in the shadow of a captured American supply tent, his uniform stained dark with sweat and dust from 3 days of retreat. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from something far more unsettling. Before him, stacked in neat rows beneath canvas that smelled of diesel and rubber, sat crate after crate of supplies the Americans had abandoned in their rapid advance. He pried one open with his bayonet. Inside, celluloid film reels, each canister labeled with English words he barely understood. Casablanca. For whom the bell tolls. Stage door canteen. Beside these, insulated containers marked with red crosses. He opened one. A rush of cold air struck his face, impossible cold in this equatorial hell. Inside, packed in dry ice, nestled rectangular cartons labeled ice cream, vanilla. His adjutant, a young man from Hokkaido who had not eaten meat in 4 months, made a sound that was neither laugh nor sob. They had been taught that Americans were soft, decadent, spiritually weak. They had been told the enemy would crumble under the righteous fury of the Imperial Japanese Army. But standing there, surrounded by frozen desserts and Hollywood fantasies shipped 6,000 miles across the Pacific to men who treated war like an inconvenient interruption of peacetime comfort, Kazuki understood with terrible clarity that Japan had already lost. This was not the war they had been promised. To understand the profound psychological earthquake that moment represented, one must travel backward to the ideology that shaped every Japanese officer since childhood. The Bushido Code, reconstructed and weaponized by militarists in the 1930s, demanded absolute sacrifice. Pleasure was weakness. Comfort was corruption. The Japanese soldier was taught to view his life as already given to the emperor, a cherry blossom, beautiful in its willingness to fall. From the moment conscripts entered training, they were systematically stripped of individuality. Food was scarce by design. A soldier's worth was measured by his capacity to endure. Records from the Imperial Japanese Army's training manuals explicitly stated that the spirit of Japan resides in the ability to triumph over physical limitation through sheer will. This was not mere propaganda. It was doctrine backed by a society that had, for decades, glorified austerity. Japan in the 1930s was a nation of resource scarcity transformed into spiritual virtue. Rice rations decreased year by year, yet citizens were told this deprivation made them superior to the gluttonous West. The soldier ate his meager portion of rice and pickled radish and believed, truly believed, that his hunger was a form of power, that his willingness to suffer proved the superiority of his civilization. And then they met the Americans. The shock was not immediate. In the early days of the Pacific War, Japanese forces swept through territory after territory with a speed that seemed to confirm their superiority. Wake Island fell. Guam fell. The Philippines collapsed. European colonial powers, weakened by years of war with Germany, offered little resistance. For Japanese commanders raised on the myth of Western decadence, these victories seemed to validate everything they had been taught. The white man, they believed, had grown too comfortable, too attached to his luxuries to fight with the necessary ferocity. But by 1943, the tide had turned, and with it came revelations that shattered the entire ideological framework of the war. Captain Hideo Samashima, captured at Tarawa in November 1943, would later describe his interrogation in an Allied POW camp with a tone American intelligence officers found more disturbing than any defiance. "They gave us meat," he said through a translator, his voice hollow. "Not once. Every day. Meat, bread, vegetables, coffee with sugar." He paused, struggling with the words. "We thought you were trying to break us with kindness. A psychological technique. But then we saw the guards eating the same food. The cooks. The drivers. Everyone." The translator noted that Samashima began to weep. "You feed your prisoners better than our officers ate in the field." This was not exaggeration. Japanese military rations, even for officers, had become catastrophic by 1943. The standard daily ration was officially set at 800 grams of rice, supplemented by small amounts of barley, salt, and occasionally canned goods. In practice, supply line disruptions meant frontline soldiers often received half that, sometimes less. Medical records recovered after the war show that malnutrition-related diseases, beriberi, scurvy, dysentery, accounted for more Japanese military deaths in some theaters than combat itself. On Guadalcanal, Japanese soldiers gave the island a bitter nickname, Starvation Island. Men ate grass, bark, and when desperation became absolute, worse. There are documented cases of soldiers dying with their stomachs full of leaves and mud. Meanwhile, American forces in the same island chains were receiving supply shipments that included fresh oranges, candy bars, and Coca-Cola. What do you think would go through your mind, watching your enemy thrive on abundance while your own nation's ideology demanded glorification of suffering? Comment it down. The ice cream was not metaphor. It was industrial-scale reality. The United States military, by 1943, operated floating ice cream factories. The Navy had constructed concrete barges, massive, purpose-built vessels, whose sole function was to manufacture ice cream for sailors and Marines in the Pacific. The largest, stationed at the naval base in Ulithi, could produce 10 gallons of ice cream every 7 seconds. 10 gallons. Every 7 seconds. Around the clock. This single barge had the capacity to produce over 1,200 gallons per hour, enough to serve every man in multiple carrier groups a full serving every single day. When Japanese intelligence officers recovered American documents detailing these operations, many initially dismissed them as disinformation. The idea was too absurd. No rational military would divert resources, steel, fuel, and manpower to building ice cream factories during total war. It violated every principle of wartime austerity. It was waste elevated to the level of strategic madness. But it was real. And more than real, it was deliberate. American military leadership had learned, through extensive studies during World War I, that morale was a weapon as tangible as any rifle. Soldiers who felt cared for, who believed their nation valued their comfort and survival, fought harder and recovered faster from psychological trauma. The ice cream, the movies, the USO shows, the mail delivery that moved heaven and earth to ensure a letter from home reached the front lines, these were not frivolities. They were calculated investments in combat effectiveness. And they worked. The cultural divide this created was absolute. Japanese soldiers were taught that suffering purified the spirit. American soldiers were told they deserved rest, recreation, and a cold Coke after a hard day's fighting. Both approaches produced effective warriors. But only one was sustainable. Then there were the movies. Major Shigeru Funaki, captured on Saipan in July 1944, spent 3 months in an American POW camp in Hawaii before being transferred to a facility in Texas. In his post-war memoir, published in 1952, he devoted an entire chapter to the first time American guards screened a film for the prisoners. It was a Western, John Wayne in Stagecoach. Funaki watched, uncomprehending at first, as the American prisoners around him laughed, cheered, relaxed. The guards sat among them, eating popcorn, making jokes. There was no separation. For those 2 hours, captor and captive inhabited the same cultural space, united by the shared ritual of cinema. I realized, Funaki wrote, that for them, the war was an interruption. They had not been remade by it. They were still the men they had been before, waiting to return to lives that still existed for them. We had been taught that we would never return. That our former lives were illusions we must burn away. Watching that film, I understood that we had been spiritually destroyed before the first shot was ever fired. The United States military, by war's end, was distributing over 400 million feet of film per month to overseas bases. That's enough to screen a feature-length film for every American service member, in every theater of war, every 3 days. The logistics involved were staggering: temperature-controlled shipping, projection equipment maintained in tropical humidity and desert heat, trained projectionists deployed to forward bases. The military even produced special combat-ready 16mm film formats that could withstand rougher conditions. Japan, by contrast, had largely abandoned film production for entertainment purposes by 1943. All cinema had been redirected toward propaganda and training films. The concept of screening a Hollywood comedy to frontline soldiers would have been viewed as borderline treasonous, a corruption of the warrior spirit with Western decadence. But here's what Japanese officers failed to understand until it was too late. The movies were not a distraction from American military power. They were an expression of it. A nation that could afford to ship frozen desserts and celluloid fantasies to the farthest corners of the earth was demonstrating a logistical and industrial capacity so vast it rendered Japan's entire war effort futile. Do you think morale and comfort can truly win wars, or is suffering necessary for victory? Comment your perspective. The symbolism of ice cream and cinema became, in Japanese captivity narratives, a recurring motif of ideological collapse. Lieutenant Tadashi Suzuki, captured at Iwo Jima, described a moment that haunted him for decades. A young American Marine, barely 20, had offered him a chocolate bar during his initial processing as a POW. Suzuki, who had not tasted sugar in 8 months, accepted it with hands that shook. The Marine smiled, not with cruelty or triumph, but with something Suzuki found more devastating: casual generosity. "He gave it to me the way you might give a cigarette to a friend," Suzuki recalled in a 1970 interview. There was no ceremony, no sense that he was parting with something precious. To him, the chocolate bar was nothing. Replaceable. Common. I had seen men die fighting over a handful of rice. And this child soldier, this boy with smooth hands and clean clothes, was giving away concentrated calories like they had no value at all. That chocolate bar, Suzuki said, did more to destroy his faith in Japanese victory than any battle. It was proof, physical and undeniable, that America possessed a depth of resources that made the concept of Japanese spiritual superiority meaningless. You could not defeat an enemy who considered luxury a baseline standard for the common soldier. The records support this psychological phenomenon across hundreds of POW testimonies. Japanese captives, particularly officers educated enough to grasp the implications, experienced a form of cognitive dissonance so severe it often led to complete ideological collapse. The Bushido Code provided no framework for processing an enemy who was simultaneously more comfortable and more effective in combat. The Americans were supposed to be soft. They were supposed to crack under pressure, to flee when faced with soldiers willing to die. Instead, they advanced with methodical confidence, supported by supply chains that seemed to conjure abundance from thin air. And they did it while watching movies and eating ice cream. The contrast in medical care was equally devastating to Japanese morale. American combat medics operated under a doctrine that every life was worth extraordinary effort to save. Wounded soldiers received morphine, plasma transfusions, and surgical care often within minutes of injury. Casualty evacuation systems, helicopters, hospital ships, dedicated transport planes, moved injured men from battlefield to surgical theater with a speed that seemed almost magical to Japanese observers. Japanese military medicine, by comparison, had devolved into a philosophy of triage that often resembled abandonment. Wounded soldiers who could not return to combat were frequently left with minimal care. The logic was brutal and explicit. Resources were scarce and should be devoted to men who could still fight. Medical supplies, already limited, dwindled further as American submarines strangled Japan's supply routes. By 1944, Japanese field hospitals were operating without anesthesia, without antibiotics, often without bandages. A Japanese army surgeon, captured in the Philippines, was given a tour of an American field hospital. The American doctors, proud of their facilities, wanted to demonstrate their capabilities. The Japanese surgeon said nothing throughout the tour. When asked for his thoughts afterward, he responded with a single sentence: "You have already won the war, and you do not even know it." What he meant was this: a nation that could afford to care for its wounded with such extravagance, that could ship blood plasma and penicillin and X-ray machines to jungle clearings on the other side of the world, possessed a material advantage so overwhelming that no amount of fighting spirit could overcome it. Do you think the way a nation treats its soldiers reveals the strength of its civilization? Share your thoughts below. The psychological transformation these experiences created in Japanese prisoners became a matter of serious concern for American intelligence. Captured officers, once confronted with the reality of American abundance, often became not just compliant, but actively cooperative. They volunteered information. They helped translate documents. Some even participated in propaganda broadcasts aimed at Japanese forces, pleading with their countrymen to surrender before more lives were wasted in a war that could not be won. This was not cowardice. Many of these men had fought with suicidal bravery before their capture. It was something more profound: the complete collapse of the ideological framework that had made such bravery meaningful. If Japan's spiritual superiority was a lie, if suffering was not a virtue but simply suffering, then what had their sacrifices been for? American interrogators noted a pattern in these psychological breaks. The moment of collapse often came not during questioning about military matters, but during mundane encounters with American abundance. A Japanese officer would be eating a hot meal, or watching a movie, or receiving a clean uniform, and suddenly begin speaking, not about tactics or troop movements, but about the lies they had been told. About the starvation. About the friends who had died from preventable diseases. About the growing realization that their leadership had sent them to die in a war that was unwinnable from the start. One intelligence report from 1944 describes a Japanese naval officer who broke down during a screening of Yankee Doodle Dandy. The film, a patriotic musical about George M. Cohan, featured elaborate dance numbers, lavish sets, and a cast of hundreds. The officer, watching this display of creative and industrial excess, began to laugh. Then the laughter turned to sobbing. "We were told you were weak," he said through a translator. "We were told you had no spirit. But you are strong enough to make this," he gestured at the screen, "while fighting a war on two sides of the world. We have nothing like this. We have never had anything like this." The ice cream barges became legendary among both American and Japanese forces, but for opposite reasons. For American sailors, they were a source of pride and humor, evidence that even in the hell of the Pacific War, some things remained sacred. Ships that had been damaged in combat were sometimes jury-rigged into ice cream production to maintain morale during repairs. When the aircraft carrier Lexington was hit by kamikaze attacks in 1944, the crew reportedly saved the ice cream machines before abandoning ship. For Japanese forces, the ice cream barges became symbols of a deeper horror. They were fighting an enemy that had industrialized comfort. This wasn't just wealth. This was wealth weaponized. Every gallon of ice cream was a psychological attack, a demonstration that America could afford to be frivolous even in the midst of existential war. Japanese propaganda attempted to spin this as evidence of American weakness. Radio broadcasts mocked the ice cream, the movies, the jazz music that floated across Pacific waters from American ships. "The Americans need their toys," one broadcast sneered. "They cannot fight like men without their comforts." But this propaganda rang increasingly hollow as Japanese soldiers, starving and diseased, retreated island by island before an enemy that seemed to grow stronger the farther it traveled from home. The truth was the opposite of what Japanese propaganda claimed. The ice cream and movies were not signs of weakness. They were flex demonstrations of an industrial base so powerful it could afford to be extravagant. They were proof that America was fighting at a fraction of its total capacity, that it could simultaneously produce bombers and ice cream, tanks and movie theaters, without strain. Japan, by contrast, had mobilized everything. Its people were eating bark. Its factories were being worked by school children. Its pilots were flying suicide missions because it had run out of fuel for training. And still, America advanced, comfortably fed, entertained, and confident. What would you have thought, seeing the enemy thrive while your own nation starved? Would it change your belief in the war? Let us know in the comments. The movies themselves carried messages that Japanese officers found deeply subversive. American films celebrated individualism, questioned authority, featured women in positions of agency and intelligence. These were not propaganda in the crude sense. They were cultural artifacts that revealed American values without even trying. A film like Casablanca, screened for troops and prisoners alike, presented a worldview in which personal choice mattered, in which a man could defy authority for love or principle and be celebrated for it. This was antithetical to everything Japanese military culture represented. The individual existed only as part of the collective. Love was selfish. Defiance was betrayal. And yet, here were American soldiers, weeping openly at the end of Casablanca, emotionally invested in a story about a cynical bar owner choosing personal honor over obedience. Japanese prisoners who watched these films often remarked on the freedom they depicted, not just political freedom, but emotional and spiritual freedom. American characters made choices. They struggled with moral dilemmas. They changed their minds. In Japanese military cinema, by contrast, the ideal protagonist accepted his duty without question and died without regret. There was no internal conflict because internal conflict implied doubt, and doubt was spiritual poison. Watching American films, some Japanese prisoners began to understand that they had been living in a totalitarian fantasy, a constructed reality where all the narratives had been carefully controlled to produce obedient soldiers. The movies were a glimpse of a world where stories could be complicated, where heroes could be flawed, where the purpose of art was not to instruct but to explore. This was dangerous knowledge. Some prisoners requested to stop being shown films. They understood, consciously or not, that every screening was an ideological defeat, a slow erosion of everything they had believed about the superiority of Japanese culture. The food became its own form of warfare. American quartermasters had calculated the psychological impact of meals down to a science. Troops received not just calories, but variety. A soldier in the Pacific might have bacon and eggs for breakfast, chicken for lunch, and steak for dinner. Canned peaches. Fresh bread when possible, otherwise bread so well preserved it tasted fresh. Coffee, always coffee, hot and plentiful. Japanese soldiers, when they overran American positions early in the war, were often more interested in captured food supplies than in ammunition. The bounty they found seemed impossible. Canned fruits, chocolate, condensed milk, cigarettes by the carton. And they were not special officer rations. These were supplies for common infantrymen. A Japanese sergeant, captured on Guadalcanal, was interviewed extensively about his experiences. He described the moment his unit had captured an American supply dump. "We thought we had found officer provisions," he said. "We could not believe common soldiers ate like this. We divided the food carefully, certain it would not be replaced. We later learned the Americans had abandoned it because it was easier to bring fresh supplies than to carry it forward." The concept was incomprehensible to him. Food so abundant it could be abandoned. He paused, then added, "That was when I knew we would lose. Not because of their weapons. Because of this." He gestured vaguely, encompassing everything. "They had made abundance into a weapon, and we had no defense against it. Do you believe overwhelming material superiority can break an enemy's will before a shot is fired? Tell us what you think." By 1945, the psychological impact of American abundance had become a strategic factor in itself. Japanese commanders struggled with collapsing morale not from defeat in battle, but from the slow realization among troops that they were dying for a lie. Desertion, virtually unknown in the early war years, began to increase. Suicide rates among officers climbed. And most tellingly, surrender, once considered the ultimate dishonor, became thinkable. American psychological warfare units, recognizing this, began dropping leaflets that didn't emphasize military defeat. Instead, they showed photographs of American abundance. Pictures of meals. Of hospitals. Of POW camps where Japanese prisoners were healthy, clean, and adequately fed. The text was simple: "This is how we treat prisoners. You will not be tortured. You will not starve. Surrender and live." These leaflets were extraordinarily effective, precisely because they didn't feel like propaganda. They were simply showing reality, a reality so different from what Japanese soldiers experienced that it felt like a glimpse of another world. A better world. A world where human life had value beyond its utility to the state. In the final months of the war, American forces began encountering Japanese soldiers who had clearly been starving for weeks, yet who had held positions they knew were hopeless. When asked why they hadn't surrendered sooner, many gave variations of the same answer. They had been afraid the promises of good treatment were lies. They could not conceive of an enemy that would actually feed its prisoners, that would give medical care to men who had been trying to kill them hours earlier. When they discovered the promises were true, the psychological impact was devastating. Many broke down. Some became angry at their own leaders for lying to them about the nature of the enemy and the war. Others simply seemed to deflate, as if the ideological structure that had held them upright had suddenly dissolved. The ice cream became a recurring symbol in post-war Japanese literature about the conflict. In Shoei Oka's Fires on the Plain, a novel about Japanese soldiers starving in the Philippines, there is a hallucinatory scene where the protagonist imagines an American ice cream barge, impossibly vast, floating through the jungle. It represents everything he has lost: abundance, sanity, hope. The image is surreal, almost mystical, but it captures something true about the Japanese experience of the war, the sense that they were fighting not just an army, but a civilization whose material reality was so different it might as well have been alien. Other veterans wrote about the movies, about lying in hospitals or POW camps, watching American films, and feeling their entire worldview collapse. They had been taught that sacrifice and suffering were the highest virtues. The Americans had proven that comfort and confidence could be virtues too, and more effective ones at that. This was not a comfortable realization. It meant that the suffering had been pointless, that the friends who had starved to death had died not as heroes, but as victims of a system that glorified deprivation because it had no alternative to offer. That the entire war, from the beginning, had been an exercise in nationalist fantasy running headlong into industrial reality. What do you think? Can a nation's ideology survive when confronted with such overwhelming material contradiction? Share your thoughts below. The transformation of Japanese officers who witnessed American abundance firsthand cannot be overstated. These were not weak men. They were products of one of the most rigorous military training systems in the world. They had been psychologically conditioned from childhood to endure, to sacrifice, to embrace death. And yet, confronted with ice cream and movies, many experienced a form of psychological collapse that no amount of combat had produced. The reason is simple: combat can be rationalized. Defeat can be honorable. Death can be meaningful. But ice cream in the middle of the Pacific, movies screened on jungle islands, fresh fruit served to prisoners, these things shattered the entire narrative framework that made suffering meaningful. They proved that Japanese suffering was not a virtue Japan had chosen, but a necessity Japan's poverty had imposed. And that realization was unbearable. An American intelligence officer, in a report filed in August 1945, noted, "The Japanese prisoner does not fear our weapons. He fears our abundance. He can rationalize dying in battle. He cannot rationalize that his enemy eats better, lives better, and cares more for its common soldier than his own nation cares for its officers. This is the true victory, not of arms, but of civilization." Lieutenant Commander Kazuki, the officer who first opened those crates on Kwajalein, survived the war. He was captured 3 days after his discovery of the ice cream and spent the remainder of the conflict in a POW camp in California. In his post-war memoir, he described the experience with a clarity that was almost painful. "They gave us ice cream every week," he wrote. "Not as a treat. As a normal thing. As if it was unremarkable that frozen desserts could be produced in the middle of the desert and given to prisoners. I gained weight in that camp. I was healthier as a prisoner than I had been as an officer in the Imperial Navy. This fact made me angrier than any insult could have. It meant that my nation had not just lost the war. It had lost the right to claim it was fighting for a better world." He continued, "The movies were worse. They showed us films every week. American films, sometimes British. Stories about ordinary people facing ordinary problems. Love, ambition, fear, hope. The characters were not perfect. They made mistakes. They questioned authority. And they were allowed to do so because the society that produced these films was confident enough to permit doubt. We had been taught that America was spiritually weak, morally decadent, doomed by its individualism. But watching those films, I realized that a society confident enough to question itself was stronger than a society that demanded unthinking obedience. I began to understand that we had lost the war in 1941, before the first shot was fired. We had lost it the moment we decided to fight an enemy we did not understand. An enemy whose abundance we mistook for weakness. An enemy who could afford to be generous even to those who had tried to kill them. The ice cream was not a luxury. It was a message. And the message was this: you were never even close to winning. In the decades after the war, as Japan rebuilt and transformed into an economic power, the memory of American abundance became a strange cultural touchstone. It represented both humiliation and aspiration. Japan had been crushed by that abundance, but it also wanted to achieve it. The post-war economic miracle was, in some sense, an attempt to prove that Japanese culture could produce abundance too, that the suffering of the war years had been an aberration, not a fundamental limitation. But veterans who had witnessed American ice cream and movies firsthand never quite forgot the lesson. In interviews conducted in the 1960s and 70s, elderly men who had been young officers during the war would speak about those experiences with a mixture of bitterness and awe. They had been on the wrong side of history, but more than that, they had been on the wrong side of industrial modernity. Japan's spiritual superiority had been a comfort, a way of rationalizing poverty and limitation. America had proven that abundance was its own form of power, and a more decisive one. The movies, particularly, had a lasting impact. Post-war Japan developed a complex relationship with American cinema, simultaneously resentful of its cultural dominance and hungry for its products. Japanese filmmakers in the 1950s and 60s often referenced their wartime encounters with American films as formative experiences. They had seen a different way of telling stories, a different set of values, and they couldn't unsee it. Do you think cultural power can be as decisive as military power in shaping history? We'd love to hear your perspective in the comments. There is a deeper truth here, one that extends beyond World War II and Japan. The story of ice cream and movies defeating ideology is a story about the limits of enforced suffering. Totalitarian systems often glorify sacrifice because they have no alternative to offer. When people are poor, when resources are scarce, the only way to maintain social cohesion is to make deprivation into a virtue. Suffering becomes noble. Sacrifice becomes sacred. And those who question whether the suffering is necessary become traitors. But when such a system encounters a society that has solved the problem of abundance, the entire ideological structure collapses. Because if abundance is possible, then the suffering was not noble, it was simply a failure of the system to provide. And that realization is devastating. This is why the ice cream mattered more than the battles. This is why movies screened in jungle clearings were more subversive than any propaganda leaflet. They were proof that another way was possible. That people did not have to suffer to be strong. That comfort and confidence could coexist. That a nation could care for its people and still be feared by its enemies. The Japanese soldiers who saw this understood, perhaps better than the Americans who provided it, that they were witnessing the death of an ideology. They had been raised to believe that the West was decadent, that its love of comfort made it weak, that Japan's willingness to suffer would ultimately prevail. The ice cream and movies proved, beyond any argument, that this was a lie. The epilogue of this story is not about victory or defeat in the traditional sense. It is about the quiet realization, spreading through captured camps and prison hospitals, that the war had never been what they were told it was. It was about young men, raised on myths of spiritual superiority, confronting the physical reality of a civilization that had industrialized abundance. And in that confrontation, ideology died. Not loudly, not heroically, but with the quiet resignation of men eating their first decent meal in months and realizing that their suffering had been for nothing. With prisoners watching a Hollywood musical and understanding that they had been sent to die fighting a nation they had never understood. The ice cream melted in the tropical heat, the movies flickered in the jungle darkness, and the empire that had promised spiritual victory collapsed under the weight of material reality. Not because Americans were better warriors, though they often were, but because America had built a system that valued human life enough to ship frozen desserts to the edge of the world. That was the real defeat. Not of armies, but of the idea that suffering was strength. Not of soldiers, but of the lie that abundance was weakness. In the end, the Japanese officers who stood speechless before those crates of ice cream and film reels were not defeated by what they saw. They were freed by it. Freed from the lie that their suffering had meaning. Freed from the ideology that had demanded they die for a fantasy. And in that freedom, however painful, there was a truth more powerful than any propaganda. That human beings deserve comfort, care, and the occasional ice cream, even, especially, in the midst of hell. What do you think this story teaches us about the relationship between ideology and material reality? About what it means to treat human life as valuable? Share your reflections below. That was the lesson of the ice cream and the movies. That was the truth Japanese officers learned too late. And that was why, in the end, they were not just defeated. They were speechless.